Hey, I'm Raj. I'm a PhD student from Georgia Tech, and I talk about bringing stories alive, generating interactive fiction worlds. This is work done in collaboration with other members of the Entertainment Intelligence Lab. All right, so jumping straight into it, let's first figure out what an interactive fiction is, right? So interactive fictions are games that deliver a narrative, with the player seeing and talking to the world using textual natural language. So what we're seeing on the screen here is an example of one of the earliest, most popular text games, Zork. So standard gameplay goes something like this. So you receive a description of the world around you. So in this case, you're standing in an open field west of a White House. There's a mailbox there. And then you type in an action for what happens when you actually put, for what you want to do. And you receive a description back of like what happens in the world as a result of that action, so on and so forth. Okay, so now the interactive fiction community is one of the oldest gaming communities, and these game devs are really quite creative. So you put both of these together, what you get are these like really large, very complex game worlds, right? And this is what we focus on in this paper. So how do you automatically generate such rich textual worlds that are able to deliver a narrative? And so there are two sort of main challenges in making these worlds. So the first is with respect to common sense reasoning. So placement of rooms in these worlds, as you just saw, must make sense according to everyday common sense norms, right? So, there's objects in the rooms that need to be placed next to things that make sense. So pots are generally found on stoves, kitchens are found in houses. And some of these might change depending on the genre or theme that you have, right? So in fantasy settings, animals usually talk, and this is something I'm almost 100% sure they can't do in our world, right? And this ties in very closely with the second aspect of natural language coherence. So everything is in text, so the text must be fluent and conform to these expectations. So the general gist of our world generation approach is that we're bringing stories alive. So we're turning a linear reading experience from something like a novel, such as Sherlock Holmes or Rapunzel, into explorable interactive worlds, right? So if you ever wanted to walk around in a fairy tale, well, this is how you do it. So the world generation happens in two phases, and each of these phases corresponds roughly to one of the challenges that we've talked about. In the first phase, a partial knowledge graph is extracted from the story plot and then filled in using thematic common sense knowledge. And in the second phase, the graph is then used as a skeleton to generate a full interactive fiction game. So generating the textual descriptions or the flavor text, so to speak, for the rooms, the embedded objects, characters, and so on. So what we do is we present a method called Aspert, which leverages the Albert model designed for contextual question answering. So the gist here is that we query this model with relevant questions to extract the kind of information that we need in order to be able to construct a knowledge graph that builds out the backbone for what this world is going to look like. So the first step is to extract a set of entities. So these entities are graph vertices from the stories. And so what we're specifically looking to do is we're specifically looking to extract information regarding characters, locations, and objects in the story. So our method does this by iteratively asking the question answering model a question with the story as the context, and then masking out the most likely answer outputted at every step. So some of the questions seen that we asked the model are seen on the screen here. So, what's a character in the story, like where's a location, things like that. So this iterative process repeats until we have all the information that we need about the world, and this gives us a vertex set of all relevant entities that we want in this world. Okay, so now we have the vertices of these graphs, but getting the edges or the relations is a little bit harder, right? So the issue is that in a lot of stories, things like spatial relations aren't exactly explicitly mentioned. And instead, we're expected to use just, thematic everyday common sense priors to fill these in, right? And so as I've mentioned before, like an example of this is that We know that kitchens are usually next to living rooms, but this isn't something that's often mentioned explicitly in a lot of stories, right? So we're sort of just like expected to know that this is a thing. And so we therefore make use of the thematic and common sense priors present implicitly in the question answering model to fill in this kind of information by once again querying it with relevant questions, right? So the questions look something a little bit like this. So, what's a location I can visit from some other location? Who are characters in this location, and so on. So this process also repeats iteratively until we have a fully connected graph. And so a fully connected graph for what this world looks like is something like this. So this is a graph that you see of a story that we fed in. In this case, this is Sherlock. So you see, there's Baker Street, there's a bank vault, there's Wilson's shop, there's like a bunch of different characters and like objects in each of these places, so on and so forth. Okay, so the next stage after we actually have the knowledge graph is generating descriptions of what a player sees when they enter a particular room or examine a character or object, right? And so this method basically uses conditioned language model generation by first locating the target entity that we're trying to generate the description for in the story, and then constructing a prompt as beginning from the beginning of the story to the first mention of the story. And then the question depends on the knowledge graph. So if the knowledge graph has identified this as a character, then the question is something like, who is this character? And so a full sort of like example of this is seen here, once again from the Sherlock Holmes example, is we're trying to figure out, who is John Clay in this example, and then we use GPT-2 to generate like a description, and we generate the description, of John Clay, short, stocky, of the taller kind, so on and so forth. So overall, this is what like one of these worlds looks like. So you see here, the descriptions for the bank vaults, you see the connections between the different locations, the different kinds of like characters that you see in each location, what happens when you examine the characters and go back and forth between these rooms. You can also play this at this URL right now. Okay, so how are we like evaluating this? So we generate worlds in two different genres, mysteries and fairy tales, and we compare against three sort of strong baselines. So the first baseline is random neural. So this is basically the same process as everything that happens, but without any sort of like underlying knowledge graph structure. It's sort of just text generation models like running rampant. The second is once again the same steps, but everything is rule-based. So both knowledge graph construction and description generation are both rule-based. And the third is once again same steps, but both of these steps are now done by an expert human. So then we conduct two human participant studies. The first is to measure the qualities of the knowledge graphs that we've actually like extracted from these stories, and the second is for just basically the full game evaluation of how people perceive the full game. And we're really measuring this across sort of three main metrics. So the first metric is that of coherence. And so the sort of questions that we asked the participants here are something like, which of these games that you played was more coherent in terms of descriptions, locations, characters, objects, and after they played both of these games. The second is that of interestingness, basically like how interesting did players like find these worlds. And the final bit is that of genre resemblance. So which of these games did they play like, most like matched with the theme? And this goes back to the idea of which matched most with the sort of thematic common sense priors that you've already had. So this is a sort of general gist of the results that we had. So what you're looking at is the percentage of participants who preferred the Aspert model as opposed to any of the baselines. And so what we're seeing is that in the mystery genre, the neural approach is generally preferred by a greater percentage of participants than the rules are random. And the human-made game outperforms both of them. And a sort of significant exception to this is that participants thought that the rules-based game was more interesting than the neural game. And the trends in the fairy tale genre are somewhat similar, with a few notable deviations, as that in this case, the neural-based game far outperforms both the random and the rules, and is in fact approaching human levels of coherence. So the main sort of takeaway here is that a thematically relevant knowledge graph is crucial to perceptions of coherence and interestingness. And so this appears to imply that filling in gaps in the knowledge graph using thematically relevant information, such as with Aspert, results in more interesting, coherent descriptions in the games, especially in settings where thematic common sense diverges from everyday common sense, such as fairy tales versus detective stories. That's all. This is where you can find the code, as well as how you can contact me. Thank you.